A new report says the United States is slapping sanctions related to more than 20 people and entities involved in Iran's nuclear, missile, and conventional arms programs. Joining me now to discuss this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joining me once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, a senior U.S. official says this will help put more teeth behind previous UN sanctions on Tehran. Apparently, Iran has enough material to build a nuclear weapon by the end of the year. And this is not good news for us here in the Western world.
You'd think that the news that Iran is even closer to a nuclear weapon than previously thought would get at least all of this country in the United States and the rest of the Western world on the same page regarding Iran sanctions, but that hasn't been the case. We have opposition to the sanctions here in the United States, as well as the European Union, who has voiced opposition to the sanctions, saying that they are illegal to snap back these sanctions. The whole point of these sanctions, as was said by Donald Trump in the White House, is to put targeted sanctions on the right entities, on the right industries within Iran, meaning that this will have less of an effect on the mainstream economy as possible. It's impossible to say that it will have no effect on the mainstream economy, but to the extent that they can help it, they'd like these sanctions to only target the industries that relate to weaponry, the military, cybersecurity, etc., and for it to truly put pressure on members of the regime that are responsible for the nuclear program, for human rights violations, and so on.
In response to the sanctions, Iran's President Rouhani says his country would give a crushing response to America's bullying. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, the Iranian regime is not going to take this one sitting down. They are flexing their muscles yet again and saying not will they only retaliate against the United States for these sanctions, but they will also retaliate to avenge the killing of shadowy commanders Qasem Soleimani that took place back in January. If you remember, the United States took out this commander who was responsible for the deaths of many Western military personnel in Iraq, in Syria, etc. So the Iranian regime is still flexing its muscles, saying that if these sanctions are put back into place, they will retaliate.
Iran's currency hit a record low this week after the Trump administration says the UN sanctions have been reimposed. In fact, the value has lost 49% to the US dollar throughout the year, including 30% since June.
Yes, the Iranian economy has been tumbling down for many reasons, but mainly because of the sanctions and because of the uncertainty. I speak to a lot of Iranians on a daily basis. I interview them about how the economy is doing, how they view the U.S. Foreign policy with regards to Iran, how they view their own regime. And overwhelmingly, the Iranian people are understanding more and more that these sanctions are meant to starve and strangle the regime and not meant to hurt the people of Iran. If you recall, in November, there was massive demonstrations throughout the country, all sorts of people coming out onto the streets from Tehran, meaning the urbanites, all the way to the rural areas within Iran. And many of them were what we call the bazaris, which are the men who work in the bazaar, who are who are really the main or the central economy of Iran. There's a triangular economic system there, and the people who are most in the place where the sanctions will bite, they're the ones coming out onto the streets and saying, we understand that this is a means to an end. We understand that this is foreign policy meant to crumble the regime, and we are on board to the extent that this will lead us to a better future for the Iranian people.
Now, European leaders have warned the U.S. that its claim to have the authority to reimpose the UN-mandated sanctions on Iran has no effect in law. Lisa, this is setting up a major clash that could lead to Washington potentially imposing sanctions against its European allies?
Yes, it might be a unilateral approach to the pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. If you recall, in May of 2018, Donald Trump fulfilled his promise of withdrawing from the nuclear deal between the United States and 5 other countries with the Iranians, and the Europeans were very much opposed to Donald Trump withdrawing. The Europeans find themselves in a very awkward position. On the one hand, they want to benefit from the economic prosperity of having relations with Iran, They want to be able to go in and out and to have the imports, exports, and have the access to the Iranian economy. On the other hand, what we call these inconvenient truths. What are we looking at? When we're looking at reports telling us that the Iranians are on the 1 yard line when it comes to having a nuclear weapon, how can the Europeans stand behind that and to maintain that they want to keep normalized relations with the Iranian regime, that they do not want to punish the Iranian regime, that they do not want to starve the Iranian regime and stop them from having a nuclear weapon? This puts the Europeans in a very awkward place, but at the same time, it puts the Americans in a very awkward place to go at this alone.
Bahrain's Interior Ministry says it was the target of an Iranian-backed terror plot, Lisa. The country managed to thwart the plans of terrorists, which allegedly received funding from Iran and members of the terrorist Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yes, so it looks like Bahrain is the target once again. If you recall, Bahrain was the place that housed the peace talks with Jared Kushner and Donald Trump leading the deal of the century, the offer that was made to the Palestinian people. It was hosted by Bahrain last year. At the same time, Bahrain was the place where the U.S. assets were housed before they went over to kill shadowy commander Qasem Soleimani. And now, again, Bahrain finds itself in the headlines as they became signatory to the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations between themselves and Israel, along with the United Arab Emirates, just last week. So, Iran is saying, look, you're our new target. You are not with us. You're against us. So now what they tried to do is launch a terror attack to let the Bahrainis know that they should be on alert.
Officials in Sudan are holding a decisive meeting with the United States and the United Arab Emirates over signing a normalization deal with Israel. Explain what that's all about.
Yeah, so this is a continuation of the Abraham Accords. About a month ago, Donald Trump, the White House, announced that they would be normalizing relations. They were brokering the normalizing of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Just a month later, they announced that Bahrain would be the second country that would add its name to the list of countries normalizing relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Now, last Tuesday, there was a signing of what is called the Abraham Accords. This is a peace deal between these two Arab nations and Israel, brokered by the White House. And at the event, which I actually had the humble opportunity to attend, Donald Trump announced that there would be more countries that would be signing on to this deal. This shows a significant shift in the region and a very outside-the-box solution to Middle East peace. For years, it was a myth that was what was just passed down from generation to generation, saying that the only way to Middle East peace would be if the Arabs, the Palestinians, and the Israelis signed a peace deal. And at this moment, we are farther than ever from seeing a peace treaty or any sort of semblance of peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But what Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law and an advisor in the Middle East, were able to do is to strike a deal between the United Arab Emirates and the Israelis, which brings the Arab world closer to Israel and modernizes the Middle East in a way that was never thought possible. So now we're seeing Sudan and hopefully many other countries be on the short list of nations that will soon be signatory to these accords.
The U.S. military is sending a half a dozen armored vehicles on a 90-day mission to reinforce its troops in eastern Syria. Lisa, that is less than a month after 4 U.S. soldiers were injured during an altercation with Russian troops in the area.
Yes, this is a reassessment of foreign policy vis-a-vis Syria in the region. The White House has said that we are going to resubmit ourselves because ISIS is a much bigger threat than previously thought. When the U.S. diminished its presence in Syria, in Iraq, the list goes on. President Trump once believed or rumored to be a pro-war president is actually the opposite. He's scaling back U.S. assets in these countries, in these conflicts where it seems like there is no end to. But right now, there is a direct threat to U.S. assets and to the U.S. directly in Syria, and that is why we will be increasing our presence there.
The Chinese Communist Party has defended its system of internment camps for many ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. Now, a white paper also revealed some details as to the breadth of its labor program. It said an average of 1.29 million workers have gone through vocational training between 2014 and 2019.
Yeah, more news out of China. It looks like, the antennas are up. People are really focusing in on the human rights abuses coming out of China. These camps where individuals are, humiliated, who are working very hard lives, that are mutilated in many cases, that are raped, that are, and the list goes on. There's now international pressure to investigate further, to look at these camps. I know H&M, which is a major clothing chain throughout the world, has pulled out its deal with a Chinese factory because of its connection to these camps. And I think more companies will now have the backbone, or to have the confidence to do the same, to fight, at least economically, if not in any other way, to show the Chinese that we mean business.
A leak of documents from leading banks revealed a massive North Korean scheme to evade sanctions by laundering money through U.S. banks. The reports revealed at least $174 million over several years through banks including J.P. Morgan Chase.
Yes, this is a phenomenal story. I mean, to think that we are not only unable to curb the rogue behavior of the North Koreans, we know nothing about them, but at the same time, they're using U.S. banks to money launder, to cover up their shady business. This comes as a surprise to many. I think J.P. Morgan will have a lot of questions to answer in the coming days. But the answer as to how they were doing this, it was through, as you guessed, Chinese companies and dual use companies. So they were able to hide the actual laundering through other businesses and the way that they operate.
A report by the Times of Israel says Honduras is set to move its embassy to Jerusalem by the end of the year. But Lisa, only if the pandemic allows it to happen.
This is a wonderful, wonderful story. Again, coming out of the Middle East, we have some good news. As you know, the U.S. moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That move was then followed by the Guatemalans. Over the weekend, the Armenians opened a consulate in Israel, and now we have Honduras announcing that they will do the same, and Israel in turn will open up a consulate in their country. So it's wonderful to hear that we are facing, this is geopolitics. This is modernity. This is countries moving forward. And to be honest, this is the right move. This is countries that will gain access to Israeli technology, perhaps a COVID vaccine, where we know that the Israelis are on the front lines of coming up with one. They'll have access to apps and medical technology and many other things. So this is wonderful news, not just for Israel, not just for Honduras, not just for the Middle East, but really for the world at large. This is a wonderful, wonderful, feel-good story.
Our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, thanks again for joining me from Los Angeles.